So, I may not be someone who is interested in haunted houses or hauntings, but I am someone who has watched a lot of takedowns of the kind of trickery involved in things like the Conjuring House and spiritualism and spiritualists and their kind of modes of operation, to the point where I was yelling about the Fox sisters during these YouTube videos. And as such, I am always kind of on the hunt for a book that will kind of fill that void. And I love the kind of explorations that looking at these kind of spiritualist movements allow for. And so looking at the spiritualist movements of the 19th century and usually the 1920s are kind of the eras that we see these narratives rooted in. And as such, I was excited to see Spinning Gold by Carmella Lowkis come out this year because I thought it would fit the bill perfectly. I notably had a book I was excited about last year that did not quite live up to the hype for me in terms of exploring similar themes and, like in this book, having a sapphic element. And so this one seemed like it would potentially fill that void for me, down to having these two characters in our leads, Sylvie and Charlotte, that seem kind of modeled after the Fox sisters in that we are picking up with them later in life, but their backstory is that they were known spiritualists, or in this book, spiritists, which is going to be very hard for me to say, so I may slip back and forth between the two. But they had this kind of long-running con that they ran with their family and have since given up this act and are pulled back in for one more job, despite the fact that their lives are in vastly different places now. However, this kind of sets up those parallels with the Fox sisters, which are interesting because it lives in that space between belief and con. Obviously, we know where the Fox sisters end up falling, which I do think means that we as a reader, at least I as a reader, came in with preconceived notions. And I think that gray area between belief and skepticism is one of the things that I find so compelling about these kinds of narratives, especially because I can read a book like this or look into these kind of movements and be like, these are scams, but would I ever sit down for a seance myself? Absolutely not. I am highly suggestible by mood music and atmosphere. And so I was going into this kind of hopeful in regards to both the story kind of being set up and that mood and atmosphere that this novel would create. And I know that I kind of compared it opaquely to a book that came out last year, but I do want to be clear that I am looking at this as its own thing, and I'm not holding it up against another book, and I'm not looking to put down any other book. But before we jump all the way into it, go ahead and like and subscribe if you have not. We are inching closer to 2,000, which I know isn't a lot for many, but it is a lot for me and something I wasn't expecting until hopefully the end of the year. So if you could engage and we can potentially get there a little sooner, that would be a nice surprise. However, either way, let's jump into this book. Spoiler alert, it is kind of following a trend for me right now in my reading life in that it has a lot of promise and all of the pieces are there, but it doesn't fully get there. It doesn't fully execute. And I think that there are a couple of things going on with this one, but there is so much potential. So I don't mean to sound like a hater, but the good news is we're gonna have a lot to talk about. So as previously mentioned, we pick up with our protagonists, Sylvie and Charlotte, after they have had a long period of separation. And I do kind of like this kind of thrusting us right back into the action and this moment of reconnection and letting us kind of feel out the relationship there and slowly understand the breakdown of that relationship. I think there is a lot of potential there. Additionally, as mentioned before, as kind of a nature of these narratives, I really liked the exploration of kind of trickery and actual belief, and this idea of potentially requiring this showmanship to be believed. There was this kind of attempt, I think, at the beginning of the book that seemed like it was abandoned pretty early to make us as a reader kind of wonder about the true nature of Sylvie and Charlotte's powers. And I do want to forewarn that there will potentially be some spoilers in this discussion just because of the nature of a book like this and kind of how delicate a lot of this plotting is. And when you are kind of dealing with this, is it real or is it not, and a little bit of a mystery angle to it, there are going to be things that may lead you as a reader to come to correct conclusions about the plotting. So I do want want to just warn you about that in case you were worried about it. I'm not going to purposefully spoil anything, but I may inadvertently spoil something. And so we're dealing with these themes of kind of what one has to do to have a voice, to have power, especially for women at this time, because we have Sylvie and Charlotte, but we also have Florence, who does not get a point of view, and I'll talk about the structure in a little bit, but Sylvie and Charlotte are basically coming out of retirement in order to help this aristocratic family who has come on some hard times, and the daughter of the house, Florence, has been dealing with some things. She's been sick. Maybe there's more stuff going on. We don't quite know, but she has been seeing a ghost of what is presumed to be an ancestor of the family that died or was killed, more accurately, during the revolution. And of course, the bloodshed that that conjures. And also, I really, really love and wish it had gone further with what that sets up imagery-wise in terms of looking at the aristocracy in France at this time and kind of the dilapidated nature of it, in that we have a moment early on in the book where they're walking into the family home in Sylvie's point of view. And so she's kind of imagining the parties that could be held in this home and like the grandeur of it, and then stripping back and stepping back into the current moment and seeing the kind of worn, rundown nature of this family home, which of course there is a lot of symbolism there, and it is a very Anastasia type moment, and I really loved it. And then having this in combination with looking at Sylvie and Charlotte, who are both of very different stations in life, starting from the same place, but looking at how they are in much different places currently, in that Sylvie kind of abandoned her family, abandoned Charlotte in order to marry a title and money, and Charlotte has been left behind caring for their alcoholic and abusive father. And so there is a lot of tension there, especially as we are connecting with these two as they haven't seen each other for a long period of time and having to figure out what footing we're on, and additionally, like, who has potentially the moral upper hand, or if there is a moral upper hand. And this is one of the main themes of the book as well, in that we are kind of framed by a fairy tale in which the idea of a good sister and a bad sister, and whether you're spitting gold or spitting toads, comes into play, but also the idea that the tests that were set up for these sisters weren't equal, and so who is the good sister and who is the bad sister. And I love the idea of providing this as a complication and a kind of reframing, and making us as readers really reconsider and reframe this. And I think the attempt was there, but I think that across the board, it just didn't go far enough. And I think a lot of that came down to it being a little bit blunter and more surface level than it needed to be, in that it didn't fully feel like it trusted us as readers to get to the kind of point or moral of the story. It told us a lot of it straight out, and I think it should have leaned a little bit more into this in the visual language and the symbolism similar to that scene in the parlor, and allowed us to really feel the place. I just don't think there was as much texture to the world as there could have been. Additionally, this book was like 288 pages, and I have nothing against short novels, obviously, but I think it easily could have had another 100 pages or so, because I think it felt like a very polished kind of outline of the main action. But I think that if we'd had some more to kind of buffer, to let us get to know these characters a little bit more, to build the world a little bit more, to have a little bit more atmosphere, and then we wouldn't need as many sections just kind of straight out telling us as readers, spoon feeding us the kind of themes of the book, and rather letting us discover them organically. And additionally, then the tension would have been a little bit more palpable in terms of us as readers kind of following some of the narrative tricks that this book was attempting, that I really, really liked, but think that we needed a little bit more in order to make it work. For instance, the book is split into the 2 points of view. So we start with Sylvie's point of view, and then we move into Charlotte's point of view. So we are kind of recontextualizing the events that we had come to see pass from this different perspective. And this again goes back to this fairy tale and us kind of considering who is in the right here as much as there can be a right and wrong. However, I, as a reader, kind of struggled with Sylvie's point of view a little bit because I don't know, even though we were in her first person point of view, it didn't feel like the narrative had fully bought in to her point of view and her justifications. So personally, Sylvie never really won me over, and so I felt like I was more in the head of kind of an anti-hero, and I felt like I was viewing, because I didn't know we were going to get Charlotte's point of view yet, that I was kind of supposed to be considering what else was going on from outside of her perspective and complicating that for myself as a reader, even as the narrative from her point of view was rather blunt and didn't allow for a whole lot of nuance. I did appreciate that it tried, and that again is why I think that it would have benefited from just being longer. I think that there was that opportunity and the voice was there, it just needed to spread out, because I do appreciate that for things like the seances, of which there were many, which I did very much like, we could see the kind of shifting tone between them, and it did attempt to set a kind of mood and atmosphere and to change that atmosphere as the action escalated, but we didn't get to fully settle within that. It didn't fully paint the picture. It started, and again, it had like these moments of calling out the tricks of the trade and wanting us to seemingly question whether this time it was real, which again circles back to, I don't know if it was clear enough where they stood in this act before. And part of that too may have been that we never really felt like we knew what their act or their business was before. I mean, it tells us very bluntly that the whole family was in on it and kind of what they did, but we never felt the full scope of it. These two were seemingly pretty famous within their own circuit, because come to find out, we learned that Florence sought them out because she knew of them. They were renowned. She'd seen a show when she was younger. And so they had some level of notoriety. And while I appreciate where the narrative kind of starts us and plops us back into that action and adds that kind of mystery and lets us kind of feel out where this relationship stands, I think it then should have taken the opportunity to flash back every once in a while, even if it wasn't like explicit flashbacks, to kind of explore the before and after there, so that we got a real sense of the difference and we could feel the weight of what the kind of events that had broken up these two sisters, what that cost was, what that weight was for both sisters, because part of the complication is the perspective of those moments. And I think that if we had fully drawn them a little bit more, there would have been a little bit more nuance there. And again, if we just had a fully textured world around these characters, it would have helped. I did like the kind of moments we were at parties. I felt that there was a little bit of a sinister tinge to those rooms. You could kind of feel the candlelight, the low light, the smoke and haze, and how things were maybe not exactly how they seemed. There was a little bit of a sinister nature to them, but I think that that really could have been upped, especially because we are dealing with kind of not knowing the truth from all sides in this story. We don't know the truth of this haunting, we don't really fully know the truth of these sisters, and we don't know the full truth of this family, why they have sought out the sisters, what their motivations are, how the motivations of every member of the family could be different. And so there's a lot of conflicting objectives, and because we don't really let the narrative kind of flesh out and breathe, it feels like the characters are flatter than they want to be. I think that there was a lot of opportunity in how all of this was constructed to flesh that out a lot more. With that as well, we are seeing two very different worlds from Sylvie and Charlotte, and the world of this family is kind of its own thing. But with Sylvie, we have her kind of operating within society, but always aware that she is an outsider in some ways, that she could be found out at any time, and so she is always kind of masking to some effect. And then with Charlotte, we are dealing with a much different Paris. She lives in a much rougher neighborhood. Additionally, she has queer storylines that put her in contact with much different realms within the city, again, than we see with Sylvie. And I would have liked both of these to be explored a lot more and to have been fleshed out and to feel the difference between the two. And I think that that creation of atmosphere would have gone a long way. And I think that by exploring that atmosphere more as well, it would have revealed more interactions and more kind of character building that could have been done, because again, we had the main action moments, but I feel like there were opportunities to really flesh this out. This was evident for me for sure in the major romantic elements as well. I don't want to spoil anything with Charlotte's storyline, but it is also being marketed heavily as a sapphic historical fiction, and I feel like there's really only one obvious avenue we can go down in terms of that relationship, but I will let you draw your own conclusions there. But I feel like that relationship could have been further fleshed out, and I would have liked to see a little bit more of that attraction and that kind of slow descent for Charlotte, especially as she was so primed to be seeking connection, and that at the start of the book for her, she was still estranged from Sylvie, and so she was very isolated with her father, and the person she is developing a relationship with is also very isolated, and I feel like there was opportunity to really draw that out more and to flesh out those moments. And there were these kind of attempts at like almost kiss moments still, and I'm not saying they weren't successful, but I'm saying if we had fully fleshed out a little bit more of that emotional resonance, I think they would have hit harder. And on the other side of that, with Sylvie and her husband, which I think was kind of the opposite in that it was this perception of a perfect relationship, but underneath it's not perfect, especially because it is potentially built on untruths, though he is aware of her background to a certain extent, but not the whole thing. And then the relationship is further damaged by her not telling him what she is up to and that she is reconnected with her sister and what conclusions he jumps to because of that. But again, we have Sylvie telling us how much she loves her husband, but it doesn't allow us to fully get to know them as a couple or experience that, even if it's not the actual truth. If there's already some cracks there, I think it's more interesting if we get to slowly discover the cracks, especially because all of that works to serve the thematic kind of explorations of the novel itself, both in like what our perceptions are and what is actual truth, and also this idea of power and who holds power, how it can be claimed, how it can be wielded against others. There are a lot of explorations there, again, that just needed some more space and some more nuance. I think this space is also important because in terms of Florence, the daughter of the aristocratic household that have sought out our sisters for help, a lot of her journey and her story and her kind of given circumstances are driven by trauma. And so without allowing us more time with her from both Sylvie and Charlotte's perspective, it feels like trauma defines her as a character and a lot of her action in a way that I don't think is fully a service to her, because it absolutely informs her journey, and I think it is attempting to empower her within the course of the novel, but I absolutely think that she deserved a little bit more space to be drawn out in the narrative in order to accomplish this. And I do think that some of this comes down to the narrative not wanting to show its hand in terms of this switch of perspective, and even mentioning that there is a switch in perspective feels a little bit like a spoiler because I feel like so much is writing on it. However, I think that if it was well constructed or fully succeeded in what it was setting out to do, because again, I think the bones are there, I don't think that would be a spoiler. Rather, that would be a really exciting development, because it is. It's a really exciting twist to be like, oh, now we're gonna look at it from this angle and complicate our notions of good and bad in something that feels like it should be so straightforward, right? Especially when we've got this idea of this con at the center of things. And are they really helping people? These two sisters have established, even in how they talked about this operation in the past, that their intent was always to help people, though of course there was always a monetary gain as well. So what exactly is that? And again, if we had kind of drawn out the before a little bit more too, I think that there would have been a little bit more punch in that. So I think again, it goes back to some of the conversations we've been having the last couple months about like an editing hand. And it does make me wonder if the author was encouraged to tighten the story in any way, because it seems like there are such obvious avenues continues to push this out, and again, to help build the kind of tone and atmosphere of this through the voice and through a little bit more languishing, for lack of a better word. I go into a historical novel set in this like 19th century setting, and I honestly am expecting a 350 page to 450 page narrative as kind of a baseline. And I'm not saying you can't go either way, but this seems like a novel and an idea and a kind of structure that demands to be a little bit more spread out. And so I'm just very interested in its decision to kind of consolidate the narrative in that way. And again, I think all of the instincts are there. It just makes it that much clearer where it could have just pushed it just a little bit further to really get at what I think it was trying to say. And I think that it just needed to go that extra step. So I don't know, I feel like at the end of the day, this was a really interesting idea and the execution just fell a little flat for me. But I think that there is a lot of possibility and potential here. So I will be very interested to hear your thoughts if you've read it, and I will still be keeping my eye on this author because, again, I think that there is something there. I just wish that there had been the permission, whether it came from external or internal sources, to push that a little bit further. So let me know what you're thinking. Thank you as always for hanging out and listening to my thoughts. Like and subscribe if you feel like it. Read something good. And yeah, bye.